do. They only are useful for electricity, which right now is less than 20% of the world's overall energy. So there's also mobility and heat, which provides the bulk of it. And much of that can't be electrified or can't be electrified cost effectively right now, even with cheap electricity. But then even for electricity, solar and wind, you look at where it's used, it's not creating this revolution of lower prices and higher reliability. It's creating this regression of higher prices and lower reliability. And the basic mechanism is because they're not controllable sources of energy, they don't replace the controllable sources of energy, namely coal, oil, gas, nuclear, hydro. Oil is just a little bit on electricity, right? They add to the cost. So you have to have the whole controllable energy, electricity infrastructure. And then you add this uncontrollable electricity infrastructure. And so that invariably adds costs. We could go into the details of that, but I don't think it matters right now. So, and what happens then is you can run a pretty reliable grid with a lot of what I call these unreliables or uncontrollables, but you have to preserve all of your controllable energy infrastructure. But what happens in California and Texas, they're like, well, this is expensive, right? Because we have to pay for these two sets of infrastructures. So what they try to do is they cut back on the controllable power plants, like in California, cutting back on nuclear, cutting back on natural gas. And then you're doing what I call reliability chicken. So you're hoping that the weather complies. You're hoping that it's not too hot, it's not too cold, and you're hoping that the sun shines and the wind blows at just the right time so you can get away with the scheme. And what happened in California last year and what happened in Texas this year is the failure of reliability chicken. So in practice, what these are is these are not promising replacements. They are cost-adding supplements. And so this so-called energy transition we're going through is a total myth. You can look at it from two ways. It's either an energy regression because we're making electricity more expensive and less reliable, or you could call it's an unreliable energy addition because we're not reducing fossil fuel use, actually. We're just adding unreliable energy. So if you understand what is actually happening with solar and wind and what they're doing, the idea of them being a replacement is just totally arbitrary, and it's either just ignorance or just total dishonesty by people who don't care at all about energy. Because imagine caring about energy and realizing, oh, the world needs much more, and seeing that track record in present and saying, oh yeah, let's just replace it all with this total failure. I mean, it's like total disregard for human life if you understand energy. And if you don't understand energy, you should not be talking about policies in energy.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. I think it's very misleading to say that solar and wind and biomass will add up to, say, I think it's 3 to 5% or something like that of total energy consumption. But it's kind of misleading to even give them that, because I like to use the term they're fossil fuel laundering. It's basically taking fossil fuels to build these giant windmills, and then putting the windmills up, and then recouping some of the fossil fuel output that went into producing these things as energy, and then using it. And I think the key point, which I discuss in my next book, after the fiat standard, I'm writing also an economics textbook, Principles of Economics, is that energy itself is not something that's valuable. What's really valuable is power at a certain place at a certain time. So energy is infinite. There's wind blowing all over the earth at all times, and there's sunlight falling on the earth. The amount of sunlight that hits the earth in an hour, I think, is larger than the amount of energy that all humans consume in a year or something like that.
Yeah,
or maybe it's in a day, something in that regard. So energy itself is massively, massively abundant. What matters is having the energy in the form that you want at the intensity that you want. This amount of energy in this amount of time directed toward meeting your particular need. And so when they calculate, that we have this much wind, they're measuring the total capacity of these wind plants if the wind is blowing, and they're measuring the total capacity of the solar plants if the if the sun is shining, and the solar panels are not dusty, and all of these, all the stars are aligning, then yeah, you have all of this output coming out. But that's not really very useful as a metric, because people need a particular amount of energy at a particular point in time, and for that you need the fossil fuels as a backup. And if you don't have the fossil fuels as a backup, then you can have catastrophic and lethal failure. people die. I mean, you know, children and children in hospitals on premature babies die if they don't get electricity to their incubators. It's as simple as that. So if the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, then your alternative energy plan means we just need to sacrifice all of our premature babies, which is what humanity did for the vast majority of human life. For the vast majority of humanity, premature babies weren't able to survive. But now, with electricity, we can build those incubators where they can survive. And a lot of the people walking amongst us today, a lot of the people who are inventing amazing things, who are producing amazing things, some of your friends were premature babies, and they're only alive thanks to the fact that they had regular 24-hour electricity. So, um, adding the kind of adding on all of these unreliable and unstable energy sources, which are produced only through fossil fuels, and considering it, saying, oh, well, they're responsible for 5%, and they've gone from 1% to 5% over the last 10 or 20 years or so. And so obviously continue to extrapolate because, everything is exponential in today's world. So obviously this is, if it goes from 1 to 5, it's going to go to 5,000% in a few years. That's obviously nonsense. It's kind of like the participation trophy of energy, where these are just, we have the fossil fuels actually what's doing all the work, and these kind of children, they're like the children dragged along to just make them feel better about the fact that they're contributing. It's like, it's it's like, you have a plastic steering wheel that you give to your child in the back seat so that they think that they're driving the car while you're driving the car. This is kind of what these things are. We wouldn't have them if we didn't have the actual steering wheel steering the car, and without the car going around and the father being able to make money and earn money, he wouldn't be able to afford this little plastic wheel that he gives to his child at the back seat to keep the child quiet while dad is driving. But it's really, it's not fair to say that the dad did 95% of the driving and the kid did 5% of the driving because he was holding that wheel.
Yeah, I mean, it is important that they are like everything is dependent on fossil fuels today. It's part of the lie of net zero. I mean, one thing that's important about what they call net zero is there's not one prosperous person, let alone area of the world, that is net zero in a way that can be scaled. So you can think about something like, oh, can Jeff Bezos be net zero? I mean, obviously he consumes a lot, but yeah, you could imagine he could plant a bunch of mangroves somewhere, right? And different trees somewhere. And it's like theoretically absorb the CO2, but that doesn't scale at all. In fact, all these tree plantings have massive scalability problems because you're creating more uneconomic forests than already exist. And that creates all these even more forest fire dangers. But if you just look at the numbers, there's no way to plant trees and absorb all the CO2 that we're emitting. And there's no way to do anything right now that in a way that's remotely cost effective at scale. So net zero, again, is something that, the reason I call it genocidal is it's something that nobody actually does today in a scalable way. And they're saying it should absolutely be mandatory to do it in less than 30 years. Again, in a world that's deprived of, that's very short of energy from a human perspective. The other thing with the plastic steering wheels, it's notable that these uncontrollable sources of energy, they're almost exclusively used on the grid. And the grid is this amazing invention. I mean, the grid allows, you think about what it does. It allows us to take unpredictable demand and meet it instantaneously. I mean, it's really a remarkable achievement. Like all of us at any given time, you can use a lot more electricity and the grid totally handles it. So it takes uncontrollable demand and it meets it. And the way that it does that is through highly, highly controllable supply. That's the only way to meet uncontrollable demand. And what they're doing is they're adding uncontrollable supply. So it's really a vicious thing, but you can only get away with it because the rest of the supply is so controllable. And so there's this parasitism. And one of the dangers of this is that there's huge accounting fraud that can take place because it ultimately all exists as one machine. So you can do, for example, what Apple does, and you can say, oh, well, we're 100% renewable because we paid somebody to give us the credit for the solar and wind that other people used, and we paid for them to get the blame for the coal and nuclear and natural gas. That's literally what happens. That's these renewable electricity credits. That's what it does. You're paying for the credit for somebody else. But in practice, what's happening is it's a relatively small percentage of the solar and wind. And then they are parasites on the controllable sources of power. And then there's all of this dishonesty. But notice nobody's building a factory with just solar and wind, right? There's no whereas you could build
Yeah.
a factory with just, coal or just gas. I mean, there are reasons a grid is better, but there are no real, besides people living off the grid at a very low level, there are no self-sufficient solar and wind solutions. So it's another piece of evidence that these are not all they're cracked up to be. Because if they were so cost effective, if storage was so cheap, solar panels were so cheap, you would just have all these independent plants that use them, and there are zero of those.
Yeah, absolutely. I've always liked to say, I wish all these Silicon Valley tech giants would try and run their servers for a week, just for a day, on purely these renewable energy sources. Like, just imagine if Amazon or Apple had to, time their operations based on how fast the wind is blowing and how strong the sun is shining, and particularly. Just imagine. Well, today, we can't. Well, we got to stop production on the iPads for the afternoon. Everybody take the afternoon off because the sun is not shining, the wind is not blowing, and so.
I mean, it would be if that's even so charitable, though, because it's not. It's just the precision. It's just so important. Like, the precision of controllable energy sources is so much different than what's happening with the sun and the wind. I mean, you need something to buffer. It's not like you can literally go up and down precisely as the sun shines. I mean, it'd just be total chaos and nothing would work at all. But yes, it's a good kind of, it's a funny thing to think about, but it's even worse than you can imagine. And it's so bad and so unacceptable that these companies are portraying it. And it as, oh, we really are running on this. And then even some of the oil companies are complicit. So BP has this absolutely horrendous ad that I find so offensive, where they're talking about natural gas, and they have this, it's in somewhere in Iowa, I think, some state begins with an I. And it's just, they have the wind, it portrays it as the wind is blowing all the time. So everyone's hat is blowing and flags are blowing and like the wind is blowing all the time. And the message is, oh, occasionally the wind dies down, so you need natural gas. And so that's the model, right? Oh, there's all this abundant renewable stuff, and then occasionally you need to burn a little bit of gas, and oh, please let us do that. It's like, that's not at all what's happening. It's really, there are these luxury goods, these solar panels and wind turbines, and we are paying to add them to the system to feel good.